All right, everyone, it's time for a little bit more about polls. I wanted to do a general informational video, though, for people who they don't quite grasp the idea of polls and poll aggregates and sampling bias and all of the other problems within polling. For instance, when I talk about polls, I talk about aggregates of polls through RCP usually. A lot of people say, well, can you trust the polls? The polls were wrong in 2016. I point out, if you look back through elections, you'll find that the margin of error between the final polls and the actual result differs. Sometimes it's quite severe, like in 2016. At other times, like in the midterms, it's less. It's negligible or it's manageable. And also, you've got to use a little bit of common sense and inference within polls. I find this effortless because I like to think about such things and analyze sort of possibilities in a habitual manner. Some people don't. So let's get right into it. Number one, when you see Trump's approval is at 51%, Rasmussen says so, ignore it. When you're seeing anything that involves a single poll, no matter how good the methodology is behind it, even if the sample size is considerable, ignore it completely. Unless it is aggregated with other polls taken in a commensurate period with appropriate degrees of margin of error, with appropriate sampling sizes and methodology, it's basically worthless. In and of itself, it can't tell you anything. It could be off the mark by 10 points, in which case the numbers that you're attempting to work with and derive your reality from are simply not real. You will be wrong 100 times out of 100 if you use that particular methodology. It's like, think about Karl Rove, 2012 election, famous example. Karl Rove had what he called unskewed polls, which was that he aggregated only polling firms that he wanted to believe because they painted a rosy picture for Mitt Romney. So he decided to say, well, I'm not going to aggregate CNN polls. I'm not going to aggregate ABC Washington Post joint polls or YouGov. I'm only going to use Rasmussen and Fox and a few of these firms. The problem is that if you look at the final results, there was a significant methodological error involved that dragged the aggregate he was looking at 3 or 4 points off. That means that he saw a lot of states as competitive that weren't. And he saw a lot of states that leaned Romney that ended up going at least narrowly for Obama. At the end of the night, he was all red in the face. Well, more than usual, because he's like fucking 500 pounds. He was all red in the face. He was all in a huff. He literally stormed off on live coverage on Fox. He stormed off the set and went to the back room to challenge these people that were aggregating the numbers and sort of updating the totals. Like, oh, what's going on here with Ohio? And it was funny. It's hilarious. Seeing his election night breakdown then was hilarious. You know, somewhat, I didn't support Obama. I was a Ron Paul voter, but it was still funny to watch. Of course, I didn't have any choice but to watch Fox at the time because, of course, my grandfather is an old-timey Vermonter, more Republican. So if you put it on CNN, he'd sit there and complain all day. So, you know, back when Fox was actually right-wing, you had no choice. These days, I think I would have just shown him the glory of YouTube or BitChute or something. He would have been a lot happier. Show him InfoWars, see what he's thought about that. That'd be funny. No, Mitt Romney lost. Karl Rove had a breakdown. He was looking at the wrong numbers. He didn't bother to aggregate properly. Nate Silver, in the 2016 election, he was so sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Why? Because he didn't bother to take into consideration the margins of error and the methodology behind polls. The problem in 2016 was that the assumption was that Democratic turnout would mirror the prior election, in which Democratic turnout was quite high. The problem is that didn't end up actually happening. Now, did it? He adjusted it a little bit for the midterms, which were lukewarm for the Democrats, but he never fully adjusted it. He assumed that there'd be 5 or 6 points more Democrats than Republicans in turnout, and that this would drag the polling a few points to the side. It didn't happen. So Trump ended up winning. The problem is a lot of the legacy media firms kept consulting Nate Silver. If they looked at RCP, they would see a different story. And there's another thing. When we're talking about presidential polling in this upcoming election, do not conflate national totals with state totals. In states, for instance, Trump, in matchups between him and various Dem candidates, outperforms his national total. And I have to say, in the wake of impeachment now beginning to falter, his approval's probably going to rise a few points. He'll probably end up at 47. That's the magic number according to even mainline pundits. Oh, the Dems are going to be, a month from now, the Dems will be 10 times more demoralized, I think, than they are now if everything goes as I expect it to go. I could be wrong, but it's a good chance of it. And that's the other thing. A lot of things boil down to chance. You can look at the odds and say there's a 9 out of 10 chance that X happens as opposed to Y, but Y can still happen. Well, how did it happen? You assured me that X would happen. No, I didn't. I told you there was a 90% chance. I told you in 2016 there was a 90% chance of Trump winning the election then. It wasn't a certainty. It was just based on my estimation of the numbers. When I'm looking at polls, therefore, right now for this election, Trump is significantly ahead of most of the Democrats, according to some polls, in head-to-head matchups in some of the states that matter. It does not matter if he has 0% support in New York and California. He can lose by a landslide in solid blue states, win by a landslide in solid red states. At the end of the night, about a dozen states are going to make or break the election. Whatever's in the middle. And you have to look at those totals and judge for yourself whether the numbers are skewed at all. That's why you use an aggregate. I use RCP, Real Clear Politics. They have the most accurate aggregate. Anyone using Nate Silver's bullshit at this point, where he tries to fiddle around with the numbers instead of just aggregating the polls that have shown that they're reasonably accurate over a span of time, he's nuts. And you have to be nuts in order to use his aggregate. His aggregate was great when it comes to the 2012 election or the 2010 midterms, because he didn't skew the numbers around so much. Since then, he's gotten less accurate. And by the way, there are a lot of people, they'll make wild claims during any election. Like, for instance, there are people who said, oh, Trump will flip California. Oh, Hillary will win Texas. Not going to happen. Pie-in-the-sky estimates are going to be a lot less likely to be accurate than something that's more, normal, you would say. The idea that just because we're in a political paradigm that things shift massively is unlikely. I would say 2016 things shifted more than I expected. I think there were a couple of... I didn't expect Wisconsin to go for Donald Trump, in other words. And I think I expected him to narrowly pick up Colorado, and I think those were the two states that I missed. Other than that, it was pretty good. Going into this next election, if you want to analyze politics, and you want to not make a fucking fool of yourself, don't ramble to me about how you can't trust the polls. You can trust an aggregate if you adjust the numbers according to whatever you conceive of as common sense. You could be wrong, but if you're using a little bit of finesse, you're less likely to be wrong than right. You can't guess the magic number exactly, but you can get close enough to it that you can tell generally what's happening. In the state-to-state polls, it's a little bit easier. That's the other thing that nobody paid attention to in 2016 is the state polls. They looked at the national number. Oh, Trump's 5 points behind Hillary. But it doesn't matter if he's outperforming in Michigan and Pennsylvania and some of these other states. He still ends up winning. His narrow win in Florida was basically a perfect representation of the polling as well. Polls can be accurate if aggregated. Now, of course, there are occasional outliers. For instance, and you may have noticed in my polling analysis, there are some times when I say, I think this poll is an outlier, so I'm going to take it with a grain of salt. This poll shows Bernie Sanders surge 15 points. This one shows Trump falling off a cliff approval-wise. Several times that's happened just because of random chance within the aggregated period, and I've called it out, and I think invariably been right about them being outliers. I think like a couple months ago they said, well, Trump's approval is collapsing. Oh, he's down in the 30s now. Based on 2 polls within an aggregated period. As soon as the next 5 or 6 came in, of course, it was bullshit. It was just a fluke. It was a little bit of noise within the sample. I pointed this out. Weeks later, of course, it turned out to be true. There was another point, I think Rasmussen had him at 52, and people said, oh, Trump surged. Well, no, he wasn't surging. It was just Rasmussen being Rasmussen. Don't assume that because they were accurate in one friggin' midterms years ago that they're going to continue to be accurate for all time. That's not the way that it happens. So you got to keep these things in mind. A lot of times as well, and this would be my final point, people's bias seeps in. They start doing what Karl Rove or Nate Silver do, and they start looking at the numbers and tweaking. They're like, well, if I move this number just a little bit, shift this decimal point, then my candidate will win, or this person I don't like will lose. Don't do that. Because again, you are weakening your own accuracy. If you're interested in truth and accuracy as opposed to bias, I have a skin in the game in the upcoming election. Economically speaking, it makes sense for me to want Trump to win because it maintains his tax cuts. If for no other purpose, I have more faith in him for foreign diplomacy, North Korea, whatever. I have more faith in him on those issues, and he'll save me money. He might even pass more tax cuts, especially for entrepreneurs. I think that's wonderful. I hope he does. But I can't let that bias affect how I analyze the numbers. If I think Trump is going to lose based on my estimation of numbers and charisma and perceived turnout and so forth, I'm going to say that because I would much rather be right than have the outcome that I want. That I don't want, proclaim otherwise and just sit there twiddling my thumbs and crossing my fingers. I would much rather be correct. That's the job of people that analyze. It's like, It's like the offshoot of journalism. The idea of journalism is report the truth, not report what you want people to hear. Cover some things up. They're inconvenient to whatever socio-political views you have. Like the legacy media, they do that. If you want that kind of reporting, go to the legacy media. And if you're a Trump superfan who can't hear within a given period, hey, Trump's having a rough week without flying off the handle, maybe you should find somebody else who's more biased in their analysis, is what I would say. And there are people who have reacted that way. Oh, how can you say this? Ah, ha, ha, Trump will win everything. Well, there are times when Trump does something shitty that the public perceives of as a bad thing, and he loses support. Now, of course, he can regain that. This happens all the time within politics. But if you can't deal with the fact that he's not actually the invulnerable God Emperor, you're not going to like the analysis all the time. He might lose a debate. He might put out an ad that's totally fish-eyed, gets him smacked in the cock. This is possible too. It's just like the Dems. Don't be a liberal, in other words. Don't be a leftist. A lot of these people have Trump derangement syndrome so badly, they think Twitter is reality, everyone hates Trump, and whatever candidate they have is going to coast to election over Trump. They are so totally fucking completely wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. They cherry pick polls all the time. Oh, Trump's approval's 39%. Ah, he's collapsing, says one Emerson poll out of an entire aggregated period. A total outlier. It happens all the time. That's about all. Peace out.